Hello, everyone, and welcome to RBCM at Home. My name is Kim Goff, and I'm a learning program developer at the Royal BC Museum. I'm coming to you today from my home, which is located on the territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations, the Lekwungen-speaking people in Victoria, British Columbia. RBCM at Home started in March when our museum and archive closed due to the pandemic. It was an opportunity to talk to staff about what they were working on from home. Now that some of us are back at the museum, it continues as an opportunity to talk to folks from the museum and beyond, and to reach out to those of you at home or at school around BC. On November 6th, the Royal BC Museum Publications will be releasing its newest book, Deep and Sheltered Waters, The History of Tod Inlet, written by today's guest, David Gray. This detailed, illustrated book brings to light the story of community and place at Tod Inlet, located near Victoria, BC. David is based in Ontario and is a biologist, researcher, writer, and an award-winning filmmaker. And today he will share some of the story of how this book came to be. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much.
Now, I first became familiar with Tod Inlet about 10 years ago, thanks to my cousin who lives near there, and she invited us over for a walk, and totally gorgeous. And I've been getting little snippets of the story of Tod Inlet. And other people may know about it because of its association with Butchart Gardens. As I mentioned in your bio, you live in Ontario. How did you first come to know of this place?
Well, I came to know of Tod Inlet when I was about 7 months old. So for me, the story of Tod Inlet goes back, well, really, I'll say 65 years, because we kept our family boat at Tod Inlet for many years. And as a child, we explored along the beaches and into the woods nearby. And sometimes we even snuck into the old cement factory ruins at Tod Inlet. And just over the years, my interest, my curiosity, my love of exploring led me into the wonderful story of the history of Tod Inlet.
Excellent. And you're going to share some of that story and history with us today, and I know you have some slides. So if you'd like to start sharing your presentation, we can learn more about it. If folks are watching us on Zoom, you can use the chat or the Q&A function to type in your questions. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also use the comment function there, and our colleague Chris will pass along any comments you have. So please feel free during or after, and David, I'll watch that for you and type in if there are some questions.
Okay, sounds good. So I believe I'm now sharing my screen. Is that
yes, terrific, I see it.
Okay. So I can just launch in, eh? Okay, well, for those of you who know about Tod Inlet, it's no surprise to you that it's a beautiful place. For those of you who don't know it, you will also not know that the history of Tod Inlet, like so many other places, goes back thousands of years. For me personally, it goes back to my childhood. And as I mentioned, growing up in Victoria, this is my two sisters and I in 1948 at Tod Inlet on the stern of our family boat. Our family boat was named the Squacoy, which is a Saanich First Nations name meaning dead wood. Because when my dad was building the boat, his friends teased him that the wood would be rotten before he got the boat finished. But that didn't happen. We had wonderful experiences as kids in Tod Inlet. And this is a shot of our family boat on the waves, on the shipways behind, and gives you a sample of the beaches of Tod Inlet that were, strangely enough, mostly made of clinker from the coal burning fires at the old cement plant that started at Tod Inlet. We explored along the shores of the inlet, and we always had the remains of the cement factory in the background. So I think you can probably see my cursor. This is the old cement factory. This chimney from the cement plant is one of 4 that were originally there, and it is almost, well, it's going to be gone soon too, because it's crumbling very, very badly right now. But this is the main plant of the cement factory, and a smaller plant here that was making tiles and cement flower pots. And this structure here is our old family boathouse that in the 1960s was, as you can see, beginning to sink. But this was the environment that I grew up in, and this is what kind of started my interest in the history of Tod Inlet. As kids, we explored along the shores of the inlet, and one of the things that we discovered or found that we didn't really understand were these large banks of clamshells. And it was only many years later that I came to realize that these were middens representing the clams that were eaten by the First Nations people who lived in that area thousands of years ago. And these very deep beds of shell also contained artifacts that showed how long people had been there. And the little sketch on the right there is a hand maul that was found at the mouth of Tod Creek, very near to this midden. We never found any First Nations artifacts in our scrambles, but when the archaeologists looked at them years later, they did find them. And so we can appreciate that the history of this area goes back a very long time. For us, the explorations up Tod Creek into the woods beyond the shores of Tod Inlet itself, this was really the beginning for me of studying the history of the area. Behind these maple trees, there's a bank that goes down to the creek itself, to Tod Creek. And as kids, this is the sort of thing we were finding. It all started actually with pig's teeth. And I don't know if you can see this or not, but this is a tooth, probably from a male pig from a boar, that we, as probably 8 and 10 years old, we found these in the banks along Tod Creek. And we used to dig them out to see who could find the biggest teeth in the jaws. And then we started seeing all these other artifacts, little ceramic pots, little glass jars, ivory toothbrushes, gaming pieces like dominoes, and what they call rice wine pots. And these artifacts, like this scoop that's in the photograph, I still have it, they were very obviously Chinese. And so when we started finding these things and collecting the interesting ones, we went back to the anchorage where the old timers told us a very vague story of Chinese workers who worked at the cement factory. And that piqued my interest. So we went from finding pig's teeth to finding all of these other different artifacts. And everything pointed towards cement. And also along the shore, we found other signs of cement, what we call dog bones and cookies. And it was many, many years later that I discovered that the dog bones and cookies were actually test samples of cement. So when the cement factory started at Tod Inlet back in 1904, there was a laboratory that had to test the cement being made every day. And they made these little, what I call cookies, little flat pancakes with a date on them. And later, these little dog bones, these are all broken ones because the testing was to see how much weight the sample could stand before it broke.
David,
Yeah.
About what year was the cement factory doing that?
It started in 1904 and it closed in 1920. The other things that we found were these big cement sacks, but they're kind of fossilized cement, and the sack that contained the cement is gone. So what happened is these cement sacks were not used for whatever reason, and they were either fell in the water or got wet in the rain or whatever, and they sort of fossilized. So it's a solid piece of cement, and you can see the pattern of the burlap on it. So these were the kinds of things that were artifacts of the cement factory. And that led me as a teenager, when I was in high school and then into university years, to try to find out more about what was going on there. We saw the ruins of the cement factory, but we weren't supposed to go in there. There were big fences and barbed wire around. But in the archives, I started finding photographs and slowly began to do my research on what this cement factory was all about, and the people, the Chinese immigrant workers that we had found all these artifacts that had belonged to them, and how they all fitted together. I also was able to find out a lot about Tod Inlet from my dad, because he had been going out there since the early 1930s, working on friends' boats, and he was taking photographs back there. This is the little photograph on the left, was a 1-inch by 1-inch photograph that my dad had put in a file of not very good photographs, and it turns out to be the only photograph in existence of the pile driver that made the cement wharf at Tod Inlet.
Oh, wow.
And then also the photograph of Petico, one of the many ships that were purchased by Mr. Butchart, the owner of the cement factory. And once I had the names of some of these ships, I was able to do more research on how they operated, and where they went, and just what their role in the cement industry was. So the cement plant, as I mentioned, as kids, we weren't supposed to go in there. Sometimes we would sneak in at low tide when the barbed wire fence didn't extend far enough down the beach, and we poked around and explored in the plant, and that gave me a better understanding of just how immense the cement factory actually was. And one day when I was exploring in the old office building, it was a very rainy day, and I was up on one of the top floors in what apparently was the post office, or the office where they kept all the records of the cement factory. And on the ground, there was a whole scattering of papers, letters, bills, invoices, all kinds of stuff. And that was a real treasure for me, because it told me so much about the company, so much about the workers, about the ships, what they were bringing in, taking out, all that kind of stuff. And as it turns out, when the cement factory closed down, they took all of the files out of the office and shipped them over to the new plant at Bamberton. But this one box of 1911 September and October survived. All of the other files that went to the new plant were tossed out at some point. So these two small piles of moldy and partly rotten pieces of paper are the only paper records from those days. I could actually look at the timesheets. This yellow one in the background is a timesheet for a blacksmith. How many hours he worked in the kiln room, how many hours in the blacksmith shop, how many hours in Mr. Butchart's house, and how many hours on Mr. Butchart's yacht. All kinds of really cool information that just was amazing in its complexity.
It seems like it got left behind just for you to find, David.
Yes, I think so. So I learned a little bit about the ships of Tod Inlet. Mr. Butchart and his advisors frequently had to decide on what to do next, and as their business grew and the number of barrels of cement that were being shipped up and down the coast, and they had to keep upgrading their ships. This was the Marmion, who was worked for the company in 1915, and this is a picture of her in Tod Inlet, just maneuvering. And that was kind of exciting. I've always been interested in ship and maritime history, and so to put together the story of those company vessels was really quite interesting. Before and after and during their role as cement boats, they all play an important role in BC's maritime history, and many of them lasted for many, many years. So everybody knows about the Butchart Gardens. The gardens have welcomed millions of visitors for years and years and years. And it's an important connection because the Butchart Gardens would not have happened if the cement factory hadn't happened. And many Victorians, especially people who have been to Butchart Gardens, know the story of how Jenny Butchart just was devastated by the impact her husband's limestone quarry and cement works were having on the environment around her house. And she wanted to do something about it. She was a bit of a gardener in the area around her house already. I think she was challenged by someone who said, "Even you, Jenny, can't make that place beautiful again." And she took on that challenge. And as you can see, this is the beginning of the sunken garden in about 1910. And the same place today is this. And so it has been a remarkable transformation, and the Butchart Gardens is very much an important part of the Tod Inlet story. When I was beginning my research back in the 1960s, it was the owner of Butchart Gardens at the time, Ian Ross, who connected me to some of the old timers who were associated with either the gardens or the cement works. And Ian introduced me to the Parcell family. And this is the Parcell family in 1904. And it shows, sorry, 1905, and it shows the shack that they lived in when they first came out to Tod Inlet. Mr. Parcell was an engineer. He worked both on the ships and in the cement factory itself. And Mrs. Parcell looked after the kids. She became a nurse. She became a midwife, and was a very important part of the Tod Inlet community as well. So I interviewed her son, who was in his 70s when I first met him, and he shared with me these photographs of the family. This is the Parcell family rowboat with the cement factory in the background. You can see a ship at the dock, the loading dock for the coal barges coming in. And this is the bank of the part of the inlet that people walk along today and would never recognize it. All of this is coal clinker from the engines in the cement factory that heated the kilns making cement. So it's an incredible change in the environment at that site from the original to then in 1905 to what it's like today.
I'm imagining the smell as well as the view is quite different.
The smell would have been very different. And for people who remember the smokestacks at Bamberton and them spewing out the white cement dust all day long for every day of the year, Tod Inlet had the same problem. So there's many places in the inlet, in the woods, where you can still find a layer of cement over the forest floor. So to pursue my searching for more information, of course, I made use of the various museums and archives in Victoria. And this photograph, which is actually the photograph that's used on the cover of the book, this was in the Royal BC Museum history collections. It was a kind of a scrapbook, photo book from the BC Cement Company. And this is one of the few photographs that exists that shows the Chinese workers at Tod Inlet unloading equipment when the cement plant was expanding in 1906 and 1907. Also in the provincial archives, I found this photograph, which was labeled Hindu Town at Tod Inlet. And this represents the buildings that the people who immigrated from India and came to work at Tod Inlet. This is what they were living in. And that's the only photograph in existence which shows what their accommodations were like.
Was it, David, was it mainly immigrant workers who were at the factory?
Yes. What I discovered after finding these photographs and doing more research in the census records was that there were about 200 Chinese workers living at Tod Inlet and working in the cement factory. And they first came in 1904. There were some Chinese workers living there and working in one of the lime kilns that was there before the cement factory. The numbers of Sikhs were lower, about 40 to 50 immigrants from India, most of them of the Sikh faith. And they came in between 1906 and 1908. The interesting thing about that photograph of the Sikh cremation, I should go back and just show you what's going on there. This is a cremation of a man who died probably of tuberculosis in 1907. And you can see the coffin draped here and firewood packed underneath it. So this was one of the very first cremations in British Columbia, and it was a commemoration of this man's life and carried out with as many of the formal traditions that would have happened to him had he died back in India. And so this photograph was spread around. It occurs in several different archives in British Columbia, but usually with different information about the place and what was going on and the date. And so one of my objectives was to try to clarify when it happened and make sure that it was indeed had happened at Tod Inlet. And so I looked through that photograph was first published in the Canadian Courier magazine in 1907, and it wasn't credited to a photographer. So I spent many, many days going through all the back issues of that magazine in the archives, trying to make some kind of connection to that story and that photograph and a potential photographer. And I eventually found out that the man who took the picture was a photographer from Ontario named Bonnycastle Dale, who spent several years in British Columbia writing articles about everything under the sun and taking a lot of really interesting photographs and publishing articles in many different magazines. And the track led me to Nova Scotia and a person who had all of his negatives in all of his notebooks. And when she heard that I was interested in tracking down more about this guy, she put them all into a big box and sent them to me, which was quite incredible. And so on these pages of his notebooks, we find over on the left, Vancouver Portland Cement Company, 120 Chinamen, 40 Hindus, 50 white. And so that confirmed to me that this photographer had been to Tod Inlet in 1907. He had written that article that accompanied the photograph. I found in his daily notebook the day when he was at Saanich Inlet, took a picture of the cement mill, the Hindus loading, and in other pages he talked about the Chinese workers. So it was very satisfying to finally document who he was, where the picture was taken, and now we can go back and make some corrections to the other archives that have got the wrong information.
Wow. So to confirm that date, we think of the photograph as 1907.
Yeah.
Wow.
And as it turns out, he took many, many really fascinating photographs in BC. Unfortunately, all of the ones that he took at Tod Inlet, the negatives were destroyed in a fire in his home years and years ago. And the only way we can find them now is by finding them in magazines that were published, or when he sent photographs to other archives or other magazines. But I put in this photograph here because he did a trip up the west coast of Vancouver Island, photographing many First Nations people, objects, and communities. So it's a pretty exciting collection of photographs.
And David, is that the story of that photographer and this how you found his the dates? Is that in your book as well? Pooja Pramar, who's watching with us on Zoom, is wondering.
Yes, it is. That story is in the book. Probably not too many things I say today will not be in the book because it's pretty comprehensive. This is just another example of two photographs taken at the Tod Inlet at the cement factory on the dock of Sikhs and cement sacks. And we didn't find those photographs until 2014. So knowing that there were both Chinese and Sikh workers at Tod Inlet, I of course wanted to find out more about them. As a young white teenager, I went to Chinatown in Victoria looking for a particular shop that people who worked at Tod Inlet would go to buy some of their groceries and so forth. And I was advised to go there and ask about the workers, but I had no success whatsoever. A young white guy going into a store in Chinatown asking about people 100 years ago, it just didn't work. There was no bridge between me and that community. And it was a little disappointing. Since then, I have made some contacts with people whose grandfathers worked at Tod Inlet, and that's been really great. So because I was having such difficulty tracking down Chinese workers, I decided to track down some of the Sikh workers, and from contacting the Sikh Gurdwara, the Sikh temple in Victoria, I was introduced to Dr. Work. That's he and I on the left there. He was a physician and really interested in history, and he wrote a book about the history of Sikhs in Victoria. And as it turned out, his wife's grandfather worked at Tod Inlet. And so that was another opening to a whole range of wonderful stories from people in the Sikh community. And these are two photographs of two of the men who did work at Tod Inlet. So just to show you the interesting.
Oh, sorry, David, the slide didn't advance. Oh, there we are. We've got the correct slide now.
Okay.
Pardon me.
Good. I mentioned there were, over time, there were at least 200 Chinese workers, and over time, probably 60 to 70 workers from India, mostly Sikhs. Of all those men, we now know the names of probably a dozen total, and the stories of probably 6 Sikh workers and 3 Chinese workers. So it just shows how difficult it is to go that far back to immigrants who came into Canada without much paperwork, and how the census records are pretty minimal. Problems with translating names, all kinds of problems for identifying people. So I'm grateful for what we have done, but it's there's still hundreds and hundreds of people that we really know nothing about who worked at Tod Inlet. And this is just a sample of a census page. I missed a whole bunch of information in my early researching in the census, because it turned out that the census taker came to Tod Inlet, interviewed all the white workers, the Butchart family, the gardeners, and then left, filled out his sheets, and that was it. So I looked at these census records and under Tod Inlet, and that's all I got. And it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years ago that I discovered that way back in the center, way on in the census records, on a day 2 months later, the census taker went back, and he actually did record the Chinese and the Sikh workers. And so that was a gold mine again for me. And it was working on the book that allowed me to go back and redo some of that research. So the census records were really important. Also, in trying to understand Tod Inlet, maps and aerial photographs are really important. And the first air photograph that I was able to find for Tod Inlet dates back to 1926. And this shows the area that the white villagers, the families that occupied the wooden frame houses built for them by the cement factory, by the cement company. So the white workers lived in this special housing village shown here. This is the road to the cement factory. And the Chinese and Sikh workers lived in this area here. And by 1926, there were only 3 buildings left in that area. The shacks that they were living in the early days would have just basically rotted away. All we ever found was a few foundations and corrugated iron roofing material. So this was formerly the laundry house for the Butchart family. And when we were kids exploring in there, there were 2 Chinese workers, Yap Tong and Yem Choi, who lived in this old building. We always used to sneak around it because we were afraid that we were trespassing. We always sneaked down along the riverbank of the creek. And then there was also this 2-story house, which was probably the Chinese, well, just the house where many of the Chinese workers lived. Certainly not all of them, because it was a 2-story, there was more room. All the other Chinese houses were scattered in the woods here. This was the field where they kept the horses for the cement plant, and this was the horse barn. So that's 1926. And the first aerial photographs taken from an angle were taken in 1930. They took 3 photographs of the area. So we're looking north in this picture. So Butchart Gardens, the road into Butchart Gardens is here. This is the gardens. This is the sunken quarry, the sunken garden. And this is the residence of the Butcharts. This is where all of the events go on now, the fireworks and the evening entertainment. And this is the Ross, what is now the Ross Fountain. That was the first quarry at Tod Inlet. And we suspect that the lime burners also excavated from that quarry before Butchart came along to establish the cement plant. But this is the cement plant itself. You can see how extensive it is. This is the one chimney that's still there, but crumbling. These other ones, these buildings were all gone by the 1990s. And you can see the two wharfs here, and the ship and the Island King, which was one of the cement factory vessels here. So when you go to Tod Inlet today and walk down the paths, you come right through this area, and this is where the picnic tables are. Whoops. I don't know what happened. I just advanced the screen. So this is where you walk to today. This is the old wharf, and you never know that it's a wharf today. It's just so overgrown with trees and crumbling bricks, whatever that came out of the kiln.
Now, David, just before you advance on, I do see we're at the 12, just a little bit past 12:30. That is our usual end time. It's so fascinating. I hope we'll keep going, but I do want to let folks know if they're watching. We are recording this session, so if you do need to go, or your time is up with us for now, we will be posting a recording of this session on our YouTube channel, so you can finish up or catch up with it there.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I have not been looking at my clock. This is a map of the area in 1935. It shows the quarries, and down in the lower corner here, it does show some of the immigrant houses. So that's quite an unusual map. One story that we didn't get very many photographs in the book on was the fact that there was a Western movie made at Tod Inlet in 1935 called Stampede. And in the movie, the bad guys stampede horses through this gulch, which they called the Black Canyon. And the hero ends up rescuing one of the bad guys who gets injured in the gulch instead of him. But this gulch today, you can still see it when you walk down the trails of Tod Inlet, the gulch that this movie was made in. So that's kind of a cool story. And today, sorry, not really today, but in the past, Tod Inlet has been used for many, many different things, aside from cement and living. But at one point, people actually abandoned ships in Tod Inlet, causing all kinds of environmental damage. And on the positive side of the coin, the Tsartlip First Nation are reusing what is considered to be their territory by taking these strips of bark off the cedar trees in a very precise way so it doesn't damage the tree. And then they use those for making various traditional garments and handicrafts. In the 1970s, we started working towards getting this area preserved. And this is one of the events in the 1990s, a march and a celebration at Tod Inlet, encouraging the government to make it into a park. And eventually in 1994 and 1995, Gowland-Tod Provincial Park became a reality. And so that brings the story of Tod Inlet to a very successful, not a close, but the start of a new era where the land is preserved for everyone, where the Tsartlip First Nation, whose name for the area of Tod Inlet is Sneakwith, gives them an opportunity to reestablish some of their traditional activities in the area and moves closer to sort of a reconciliation with what has happened in Tod Inlet in the past. So I will stop the slideshow there.
Just before you stop, a question from Jessica is wondering about this photo. Is that a bunker of some sort, she wonders?
This photo is the last remaining structure of the days of the cement plant. So this was a little storehouse, which was used on either side of it was the cookhouse and the men's bunkhouse. And the storehouse was in the background in the middle. And so they stored stuff in there. But one year in the 1940s, one of the men who worked at the cement factory actually lived in the 3-room storehouse. He had to go in and out all 3 doors to get to where he slept and where he ate and where he hung out. But fortunately, that structure is still there, and we're hoping that it will remain.
Sorry, that was Shannon who was wondering that, and a couple of other people as well, because that is a building, as you say, that folks can still see when they're down there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Dave, we'll get you to stop that sharing now. There have been some questions coming in all through the presentation. I gave you a couple of them, but first one that we see is about you and being on that boat in Tod Inlet. And the question was wondering, was that a year round? Did you live on the boat all year, or was this just a summer place that you've been to?
We didn't live on the boat. We used the boat for my dad's week of summer vacation. We would travel from Tod Inlet around in the Gulf Islands. But during the year, we would often be out on the boat on weekends, and particularly in the summer. So we would spend the weekend out there swimming and fishing and searching for treasure.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And Lori was wondering, and you covered this a little bit, but maybe just to recap, she was wondering how many people were employed at a time. So when you showed us that 1907 document from the photographer, I think you said it was 140 Chinese people, maybe 50 Sikhs at the time, and how many
40 whites was on his list. Yeah.
Around 230 people-ish in that
Yes.
particular year. Would that have been high, or do you think were the numbers? I guess it'd be variable.
It did go higher than that for a time, but the Sikhs actually left in about 1911 or 1912. And it's not clear whether they hired more Chinese workers to make up for that. Yeah, so the numbers fluctuate, but it's really hard to keep track of them because, the census is only every 10 years. And there's no other valid records. The city directories always included Tod Inlet, but only the whites. Mm-hmm. And the families that were living in the houses. So they only in one directory in all those years, they mentioned there were 200 Orientals working there.
Jessica on Facebook, she's asking, what kind of ships would dock there and where were they typically from?
Okay, lots of different ships docked there. CPR ships coming out of Victoria would stop at Tod Inlet to pick up cement. Princess Mary, for example. It's hard to believe that those big ships came into Tod Inlet because coming in yourself in a kayak or even a cruiser, it's pretty narrow, but they did. The title of my book, Deep and Sheltered Waters, is a direct quote from the Board of Trade, who announcing the start of a cement factory there, mentioned the fact that the waters were deep and sheltered, which allowed big ships to come in to load cement. So as well as the cement company ships that, the ships that were owned by the cement company, there were many other vessels that were hired to chartered to come in and pick up cement or deliver raw materials. So the maritime history of that one little inlet is really quite intense.
Absolutely. And to see a little bit more of that area, David, you did give us some video footage as you're our filmmaker. So we'd like to just maybe pop that up now. And I don't know, we will turn off the sound. So if you want to speak over top of it or let folks know what they're seeing, that would be terrific.
Okay. Yeah, the background to this film is that it was filmed not by me, but by a colleague of mine during the Canada C3 expedition. I was involved in planning the expedition, and one of the first places I put on my list was Tod Inlet. And so in 2017, just almost exactly 3 years ago, on October the 27th, here we are at Tod Inlet with a group of 30 participants from the Canada C3 ship who had come all the way around from Toronto. And here I'm talking with descendants of some of the Sikh workers at Tod Inlet. So Diwan Singh's grandson and great-grandson were there at Tod Inlet, and we had over 100 school students from the Victoria area. So Canada C3 had 4 main themes: reconciliation, the environment, youth engagement, and diversity and inclusion. And Tod Inlet fits perfectly into those 4 themes. Looking at the environment here, this is actually where the Chinese and Sikh workers lived, this site right here. And it's hard to believe until you start poking around on the ground. And Paul Joel, whose grandfather, Diwan Singh, came here, Paul and his grandson Nicholas had never been to Tod Inlet before, and to have them there at that Canada C3 event was really special for me. He was quite emotional about the fact that his grandfather lived right in this spot where we were, and we talked about. I'm pointing out where the Chinese bunkhouse was, and we're looking at various things on the ground that show that people were living here. And when you move the maple leaves out of the way, you can see the signs of people living there over 100 years ago. And Paul shared with us a little bit of his grandfather's history. I'm sorry that the video is so slowed down. It's a little harder to watch that way, but it was an emotional time for many of us on that trip, talking about reconciliation with First Nations people, reconciliation with the immigrants from China and India who were treated so poorly, and getting the students involved. They come out to that place at Tod Inlet every year. The teacher brings the class out every year to explore the history and the environment of that special place.
Absolutely. For folks who aren't maybe familiar, Canada C3 was part of Canada's 150th celebrations in 2017, and it was coast to coast to coast. So a ship with scientists, artists, students traveled the 3 coasts of Canada and ended up here in Britain. This was the last stop, or towards the end of the trip. Was that right, David?
Yeah, the last stop before the final day in Victoria. So it was Toronto to Victoria.
What is that foundation there that we just went by? It was sort of an L-shaped.
This foundation is the foreman's house. So the foreman's son, Dem Carrier, was one of my favorite informants, and he took me around, showed me the foundation of his own house. We can see it here in this photograph too. And he actually showed me the spot where he buried his collection of coins when he was a kid,
Oh.
and they've never been dug up.
Oh, so more to explore and to see.
Yeah,
David,
hopefully
thank you
something
so
more to explore.
Absolutely. I want to thank you very much. Such an important book to bring forward more of the stories of the communities who work there, and the stories that we haven't always heard, and particularly the difficult work you did finding the names of the Sikh workers and putting names to all of those, and sometimes just that have been in the past just numbers. And you said that's an important step forward. And I'm so glad it's been documented in the book. The book is available. It's being officially released on November the 6th. And you can purchase a copy through the Royal BC Museum's website if you visit our publications page and many fine bookstores around the country. So I want to, again, thank you all for joining us. If there was something you missed or want to go back, again, this has been recorded, so you can have a look there if you want to share it with somebody else who maybe wasn't watching today. The Royal BC Museum has reopened, and we are ready to welcome you back. Our feature exhibition, Emily Carr, Fresh Scene, has just opened. And if you're interested in coming, we encourage you to book your time ticket in advance online. We are continuing our at-home kids, and outside programs for the foreseeable future, and links for all these programs are posted on the museum's website. So until next week, take care of yourselves and one another. Thank you. See.